Imagine you're a coder in the 70s. You've spent hours crafting a piece of software that solves a complex problem, and you want to share it, improve it, see where others could take it. But back then, sharing code wasn't simple. Today, it's a given that we can share, collaborate, and build on each other's work. How did we get here? To understand, we need to go back to when the idea of open software was practically unheard of. 1960s, birth of software sharing. Let's start in the 1960s. Back then, computers were enormous, room-sized machines, mostly in universities and government labs. Programmers wrote software not to make money, but because they were excited about what these machines could do. Sharing code wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. If you wanted to solve a problem, someone else's code could be your solution. In those days, people would trade programs on punch cards, much like trading baseball cards. There was no concept of keeping it private. Everyone collaborated, and software was seen as a common good. The rise of commercial software and closed source. But by the 1970s, things started to change. Companies realized that software could be profitable. This marked the start of closed source software you couldn't freely modify or share. If you bought software, you were buying the product, not the code. Suddenly, what you could do with a program was limited by legal terms, not technical ability. For many programmers, this was frustrating. Imagine spending money on a tool, but being forbidden from improving or adjusting it. This closed environment was the beginning of a walled garden in the software world, and that didn't sit well with everyone. 1983, Richard Stallman and the birth of the free software movement. Now meet Richard Stallman, a programmer at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab. Stallman was famously frustrated when a printer stopped working, and he realized he couldn't access the code to fix it. That one moment sparked a fire in him. In 1983, Stallman did something revolutionary. He started the free software movement. He believed that software should be free. Not free like a free sample, but free like free speech. This was the beginning of the GNU project, an effort to build a fully free operating system. Stallman also wrote the GNU General Public License, or GPL, which meant anyone could use, share, or modify code, so long as they passed that freedom along to others. 1991, Linus Torvalds and the creation of Linux. The real turning point came in 1991 when Linus Torvalds, a 21-year-old computer science student in Finland, wrote a small operating system kernel just for fun. It was limited, but it worked, and rather than keeping it private, Linus shared it on an online forum and invited others to help improve it. People loved it. Developers from around the world jumped in to help Linus build Linux. This wasn't just Stallman's dream in theory, it was in action. Linux became a phenomenon, proving that open source could work, and it became a staple in servers and systems everywhere. 1998, Netscape and the term open source. By the late 90s, open source was gaining attention, but it wasn't mainstream. In 1998, a major shift occurred. Netscape, one of the biggest web browser companies at the time, decided to release their browser code as open source to compete with Microsoft's Internet Explorer. This was the first time a big company openly embraced the open source model. It was groundbreaking. Around this time, the term open source was coined to replace free software, a term that sounded too much like free of cost. Open source was easier for companies to understand, and it helped the movement break through to the corporate world. 2000s, the golden age of open source projects. The early 2000s were like the golden age of open source. Projects like Apache for web servers, MySQL for databases, and Mozilla Firefox for web browsing became essential tools. These weren't just hobbyist tools. They were used by companies, universities, and individuals around the world. And in 2005, Linus Torvalds created Git, a version control tool that changed open source collaboration forever, making it easier for thousands of developers to work on projects together from anywhere. 2010s, corporate embrace and GitHub's rise. By the 2010s, open source was no longer a fringe concept. It had gone corporate. Companies like Google, Facebook, and even Microsoft started releasing their own open source projects. Google gave us TensorFlow, a game changer in machine learning. Facebook released React, revolutionizing web development. And Microsoft. Microsoft did something no one expected. In 2018, Microsoft bought GitHub, the world's largest platform for open source collaboration. And in an even bigger surprise, Microsoft made their flagship .NET framework open source. It was a complete turnaround from the days when they actively opposed open source software. Today, open source is everywhere. From Android to Linux servers, from web frameworks to AI tools, open source software powers much of our world. And it's not just about the tools themselves. Open source software has fostered a community, a culture of collaboration and shared knowledge. Programmers from all over the world contribute, learn, and grow through open source projects. 2020's open source in times of crisis. In recent years, open source development has even responded to global crises. During the COVID-19 pandemic, developers and scientists worldwide shared data, software, and algorithms openly to track the virus, model its spread, and develop vaccines faster. Open source became an essential tool for collaboration, proving that when we share our tools and knowledge, we can solve problems faster and more effectively. The legacy of open source. From Richard Stallman's frustration over a printer to Linux and GitHub, open source has transformed from a radical idea into a backbone of modern technology. Open source software isn't just about code. It's about community, learning, and shared growth.